in a sport like MMA, where to just begin your fighting journey, you have to be a pretty ballsy and brave person. How does one man stand above the rest as the most fearless fighter at them all? Well, today, I hope to find out how that fighter, Max Holloway, went from learning how to fight through fighting games, through UFC games back in the day as a 16-year-old, to who he is today, UFC champ, former BMF champ, and in my opinion, the most fearless UFC fighter ever. Anyway, let's get straight into it. Born as Jerome Max Kelly Holloway on December 4th, 1991 in Hawaii, Holloway's early life was shaped by lots of bad shit going on. Okay, his childhood was filled with drugs, crime, and violence. His parents struggled with addiction with various drugs, and his father's abusive behavior added layers of just a shitstorm to his upbringing. But Max, like a lot of people who weren't getting the childhood they deserved and were in pretty shit situations, found refuge in martial arts, and he began kickboxing at the age of 15. A funny story is the reason why Max actually started martial arts and, began his journey is because he was playing the UFC games back in the day, and he thought that shit was cool as fuck. Okay, and he actually learned the basics by copying the UFC games and the animations of the games, which he spoke about in this clip here.
So what did you do for striking?
You really want to know what I did?
Yeah.
The UFC game, do stuff with them. I'd be like, oh yeah, this works in the game. So my friend at the time, Dustin Kimura, he would kind of hold mids for me, and I'd be like, look, I tried this in the game and it was working. Let's try it. And we did it. I figured it out from freaking UFC, the regular UFC game, the first ever UFC game.
What?
Now, Max would actually have his first fight 2 days into training. This is where the fearlessness begins, you know what I'm saying? 2 days into training, this guy get offers a fight, he don't give a fuck. He takes it. I sound like Joe Rogan right now, like the way, I'm glazing and shit. This is what like these type of videos turn into. Just me sucking the dick of the fighter I'm talking about. But see, this is where the fearlessness comes into it. 2 days into training, and this guy accepts a fight and goes on to winning. Now, this wasn't a pro fight, and it wasn't an MMA fight either. Max would have his first amateur MMA fight in March of 2010, and in September of the same year would make his pro debut. He would go 3-0, 4-0 actually. He'd go 4-0 on the regional scenes, getting a finish on the way he KO'd someone, the other 3 were decisions. But as a 4-0 guy who was 19, 20 years old, he would make his UFC debut against Dustin fucking Poirier. Dustin Poirier is the fucking perfect person, Max Holloway, to be making his pro debut against. It just makes sense for the guy's overall career. Obviously, this isn't prime Dustin Poirier. This is also a young version of Dustin Poirier. This was P-head Poirier. This was bald Poirier. And this was Poirier really, just wasn't the level that he'd get to in like fucking 6-7 years, like 2018 to like 2022 Poirier. That was probably like prime Poirier. But this is where Max would suffer his first defeat, where he'd get put into like a triangle, refuse to tap, and then be put into an armbar after. And obviously, you gotta tap to a limb submission. You can get knocked out, but getting your shit broken is kind of tough. So this is where Max would suffer his first defeat in his pro career. But after this, he'd actually go on a 3-fight win streak, beating Pat Shilling, then finishing Justin Lawrence, and then beating Leonard Garcia by split decision. Obviously, none of these guys are like big names or anything like that, but what do you expect? Bottom of the barrel UFC. And in his first year in the UFC, he actually fought 4 times, so he was extremely active. Then going into 2013, he'd lose a split decision to Dennis Bermudez, and then he'd fight Conor fucking McGregor on the rise. So we've got Max Holloway, who's not even been in the UFC for 2 years at this point, and he's already fought the likes of Dustin Poirier and Conor McGregor. Now, obviously, he lost to Conor, but he didn't lose to Conor, like prime Conor, the way you think Conor would beat someone. Conor actually wrestled him. the entire time. Now this was partly due to an injury, but he wasn't outstruck by Conor. He got wrestle fucked pretty much the entire time, and it was probably the one boring-ish performance that Conor's rise up the UFC rankings. After this, Max Holloway said fuck you to everyone else and went on a 10-fight win streak, beating like Cub Swanson, Charles the Bronx, Jeremy Stevens, Ricardo Lammers, and then he would go on to beat Anthony Pettis to win the interim belt. Now, at the time, you had Max Holloway, who was 3-3 in the UFC. Okay, he lost to Dennis Bermudez, who's like a recognizable name, but didn't really go on to do much. And he lost to Dustin Poirier, who, you know, was a prospect, but people didn't think he'd be as good as he became. The Conor loss was forgivable. Conor was very hyped up at the time, you know, and definitely went on to meet that hype. But you got this 3-3 guy that's a fuck you to everyone else, massively improved, and then went on a 10-fight win streak. And he got to the point where he was challenging for the throne against Jose Aldo, in my opinion, the 4th or 3rd greatest MMA fighter of all time, and in everyone's opinion, one of the GOATs. Now, going into this fight, Max was definitely the underdog. Like, shit, we're in front of Aldo ring, but you had Max Holloway, okay, he was like, fuck knows, like 25 at the time? Something like that. This was like 2017 time. I think he was 25. He was like 25, okay? Young guy. And he went in there and he dominated Aldo. And I fuck with Aldo heavy, okay? So it hurts my soul to say. But he fucked up Aldo really bad. And then did it again in the rematch. Okay? Twice in a row fucked up Aldo. You know, gets his first defense in there. And then he'd go on to fight Brian Ortega. I'm sure everyone knows who Brian Ortega is. But at this time, Brian Ortega was insanely hyped up, undefeated, young guy. You know, was submitting guys left and right. Was a monster. Was a grappling god at the time. Was just killing people, just destroying people. Insanely hyped. And Max really wasn't getting the respect put on his name. But he'd go on to beat Brian Ortega with one of the most dominant performances in UFC history. Now at this point, Max had 2 defenses, and he was like, fuck it, I'm going for double champ. There's an interim opportunity at lightweight, and he fought Dustin Poirier once again. This was prime Dustin Poirier. This was no longer P-head Poirier. Now he would lose this, but he definitely put on a showing. He gave Dustin the biggest run for his money anyone did at around about this time on the feet. You know, put a great performance on, and Max did had a terrible weight cut. Okay, Max had excuses and he didn't use them. Moving back down, he'd go on to beat Frankie Edgar to get his 3rd title defense. This wasn't very impressive. You know, Frankie was definitely a good win, but it was our prime Frankie, and it was probably his worst title defense. Also, throughout Max's title reign, this is where the fearlessness comes in. He fucking filled in to fight Khabib on short notice. Isn't he fucking awesome? He filled in to fight Khabib, and he got pulled out not from his own accord, but because the doctors in the UFC literally forced him to and wouldn't let him fight because the weight cut was that bad. This is how fearless this guy is. He's willing to fight Khabib on short notice, and the UFC and the staff had to save him from himself because his body couldn't do the weight cut. Crazy. Now at this point, troubles would arise. Max would bump into a little man by the name of Alexander Volkanovski, and he'd lose the first fight, but the second fight was a bit more interesting. Max clearly won the first and second, even knocking Volk down with a head kick at one point. The 3rd round really could have gone either way, and the 4th and 5th went to Volk. So this fight was extremely close, but he didn't get the nod from the judges. But Max didn't care. Max went on to his next fight against Calvin Kattar, and in my opinion had the 3rd most dominant performance in UFC history against Calvin Kattar. Absolutely dominating this guy, having the performance of the year, having the performance of a lifetime, and it really looked like Max was on a different level. Now Max's next fight would be against Yair Rodriguez. Yair, obviously dangerous contender. Max had no cares. Max went in there, had a war with Yair, and ended up beating him by unanimous decision. Now at this point, Max clearly deserved another title shot, and he got it, but it didn't go his way at all. He got dominated by Volk, but didn't quit once. Kept on moving forward, kept on trying to win, and he didn't get like properly hurt or knocked down once. He took all the shots, and he didn't quit on himself. At this point, Max was in a very, very sticky situation. He's had 2 cracks back at his belt, and he's lost both times, and the last time was extremely dominant, and it's been to the same guy every time, so it's very hard to justify a rematch. Max would fight another 2 times at featherweight, defeating top rising young contender Arnold Allen, and faces a Korean zombie knocking him out cold. Then at this point, Max would accept maybe his hardest matchup in his career yet, from most people's point of view. Oh shit, my bad. Max would accept his hardest matchup up to this point, from most people's point of view, Justin Gaethje. Obviously, you know who Gaethje is. Insanely powerful, insanely aggressive fighter. It's always a war with Gaethje. Gaethje's insanely dangerous, and Max was the underdog coming into this. So what does Max Holloway, the most fearless fighter in UFC history, do? He dominates him. He clearly wins 4 out of 5 rounds. And then at the very end of the 5th round, which he's about to win, he KOs Justin Gaethje in the last second. To have possibly the greatest KO of all time. And what the fuck? And now at this point, Ilia Topuria is the featherweight champion. It's no longer Volk. And Max will face Ilia Topuria this weekend at UFC 308 in Abu Dhabi. Now for me, Max's career so far has proved that he's the most fearless UFC fighter. And we'll see if he can regain his belt this weekend. Anyway man, in a bit.